The town of Gisate, nestled in the Lombardy region of Italy, is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the pace of life slows, and where nothing seems out of place. With just over 5,000 inhabitants, it felt like a sanctuary, a peaceful town untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But in this tranquility, there existed a family that appeared from the outside to have it all: the Bresses. Mario Bressi, a warehouse worker, and Daniela Fagalini, a biomed engineer, had been married since 2003. They were the embodiment of a perfect couple. Their lives seemed to follow a predictable pattern: work, home, and family activities. They had 2 children, twins, Helena and Diego, born in 2008. It was a well-structured life, rooted in the small but comfortable rhythms of suburban existence. The Bresses lived in a house near the mountains, a place that offered not just a home, but an escape to nature. Weekends were spent hiking, and the family made it a point to enjoy the outdoors. Mario and Daniela were the kind of parents who encouraged their children's talents. Helena, a talented skater, spent hours perfecting her moves on the rink. Diego, on the other hand, had a passion for soccer. His trophies lined the shelves of their living room, each one a testament to his dedication. Despite the picture of an idyllic life, there were cracks. Small ones at first, barely noticeable to anyone except those closest to them. The couple's relationship, while outwardly calm, had begun to show signs of strain. It was subtle, but Daniela had started to confide in friends that something was wrong. She had lost that spark, that connection with Mario. The love that once defined their marriage had faded, replaced by a sense of indifference, even resentment. By 2020, the strain had become undeniable. The global pandemic had forced people into isolation, into closer quarters with those they were living with. For Mario and Daniela, it was a tipping point. The lockdowns meant they were stuck together in their home, unable to escape the growing tension between them. Daniela began speaking more seriously about divorce, the strain, the constant proximity, the inability to escape the house or each other. These things pushed her to a breaking point. Mario, however, seemed to take it in stride. On the surface, he remained calm, almost unnervingly so. He never raised his voice, never argued. People who knew him described him as a quiet man, gentle even, the kind of person who would go out of his way to avoid conflict. When Daniela told him she wanted a divorce, he agreed without protest. They quickly reached an understanding about joint custody of the children and the division of assets. The divorce seemed like it would be a simple matter, a quiet parting of ways. But beneath the surface, things were unraveling. Daniela didn't know it at the time, but the calm exterior that Mario wore hid a growing storm inside him. He didn't just accept the divorce, he resented it. He blamed her for tearing their family apart. And as the days passed, that resentment festered into something darker, something far more dangerous. The cracks in their marriage weren't just about love lost, they were about power, control, and a man who felt betrayed by the one person he thought would always be there. Mario's calm demeanor was a mask, a facade that concealed the bitterness building inside him, and with every passing day that bitterness grew. The summer of 2020 should have been a time of renewal for the Bressi family. With the pandemic weighing heavily on the world, families everywhere were seeking solace in their homes, attempting to salvage some form of normalcy amid the chaos. For Mario and Daniela, the decision to divorce seemed like the final chapter of a relationship that had long been in decline. After years of discontent, their split was an inevitability. It wasn't the divorce itself that caused Mario's rage. It was Daniela's choice, her decisive act to break away from the marriage. She had chosen to end their family life, to tear apart everything they had built together. To Mario, this was not just the end of a marriage, it was a betrayal of the life they had once shared, of the dreams they had once nurtured together. His calm acceptance of the divorce papers had only been a surface-level concession, a way to avoid confrontation in public, to maintain the illusion of peace. But beneath the facade, something darker had taken root. Mario had long suspected that Daniela no longer cared for him, that her affection had shifted toward a more independent life. Her daily calls to her family, her long talks with friends, and her quiet hours spent in solitude at the house, it all pointed to a woman who had mentally and emotionally checked out of their marriage. As soon as Daniela began discussing divorce seriously, Mario began to retreat further into himself. His outward demeanor, however, betrayed none of the storms swirling within. He never raised his voice, never lashed out. He wore his sorrow as a mask, one that veiled the bitterness eating away at him. It wasn't just about the loss of love. No, Mario couldn't let go of the anger he felt toward Daniela for making this decision without warning, without any hope of reconciliation. It was as if, with a single conversation, she had erased everything they had built. He felt insignificant, a mere pawn in a game he hadn't signed up to play. And like all men consumed by bitterness, Mario began to think about revenge, a way to make her feel the same pain he was experiencing. By June, things had taken a darker turn. Mario had grown increasingly quiet, but those around him could feel the shift. Even his children, Helena and Diego, noticed the change in their father. His smile was thinner, his gaze colder. It was as if he had already mentally severed his ties with them. Despite the tension at home, the divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly. Daniela had agreed to joint custody of the children, and the division of assets was straightforward. They were in the process of finalizing everything. It should have been a clean break, but something in Mario's mind snapped when he realized that the arrangement might not grant him the control he so desperately wanted. The children, those two bright souls who had once been his pride, were the final pieces in a game he no longer wanted to lose. With the pandemic still raging across the country and travel restrictions in place, the family's plans to spend time together in their mountain house took on a new form. The house was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where they could reconnect, away from the stresses of city life. But to Mario, it would become the perfect setting for the final act. Daniela had planned to join them, but at the last minute, her parents fell ill and she decided to stay behind to care for them. Mario, though outwardly understanding, saw this as his opportunity. It was the perfect excuse for him to take the children for a weekend away, alone. It would be just him and the kids, a chance for him to solidify the bond he still hoped to hold on to. He hadn't yet realized that his fixation on the past, his desire for control, would soon send him down a path from which there would be no return. The day they left for the mountain house, Daniela kissed the kids goodbye over the phone. They were excited for the trip, especially since it had been such a long time since they had gone on one. Mario assured her that everything would be fine, that he would keep the children entertained and safe. It was the kind of reassuring statement parents make when they drop their children off for a weekend getaway. There was nothing in his tone to suggest anything was wrong. In fact, he seemed uncharacteristically calm. Daniela spoke briefly with Helena, who eagerly described plans for a hike through the forests surrounding the house. Diego was looking forward to exploring the trails on his bike. They sounded happy, content. There was no reason for Daniela to suspect that anything out of the ordinary would happen. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Mario sat alone in the quiet house, staring out at the darkened mountains. In his mind, a plan began to take shape. The house was isolated, far from the prying eyes of neighbors and friends. The darkness of the night seemed to speak to him, urging him to act, to make the final, irreversible decision that had been brewing inside him for months. Mario had never been a violent man, at least not in the physical sense. But in the face of the torment he felt over the dissolution of his family, he began to see violence as his only means of reclaiming control. Daniela had taken everything from him, and now, in his twisted mind, it was time for her to experience the same loss. The children, once his greatest joy, would now become his instruments of revenge. He moved slowly, deliberately, his heart beating louder in his ears with every step. He could hear the children's soft breathing from the other room. Helena, with her gentle dreams of skating and adventure. Diego, with his unflagging passion for soccer. They were his world, and now he was about to destroy it. There would be no warning, no goodbyes, just the cold reality of a father's shattered mind taking a final, unforgivable step. As the night grew darker, Mario's resolve solidified. The following morning would bring the end of everything. He would make Daniela understand the pain she had caused him, and there would be no going back. The morning of June 27th arrived like any other, but for Daniela, it would be a day that would forever scar her soul. The frantic phone calls that began at 6 a.m. were the first clue something was terribly wrong. At first, she hadn't thought much of the missed calls from her children the previous night. After all, they had been busy with their father, exploring the mountains and enjoying their time together. She assumed they were just distracted by their adventures. But now, as the early hours of the morning stretched on and the calls went unanswered, a gnawing sense of unease crept in. By 7 a.m., her anxiety was palpable. Daniela had tried reaching Mario several times throughout the night, only to be met with silence. She hadn't been able to get a hold of him either. It was completely out of character for him to ignore her calls, especially considering their ongoing communication about the divorce and the children. Something didn't feel right. In the back of her mind, Daniela told herself not to jump to conclusions. It could be something simple. Maybe the children had fallen asleep early after a long day, or perhaps Mario had taken them out of the house for a hike, leaving their phones behind. But even as she rationalized it, a deep, instinctive dread settled in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. As she reached for her phone again, the screen lit up with a series of messages from Mario. The first message arrived at 3 a.m. "You will never see your children again. Your fate will be to end up alone. You have destroyed everything we had." Then another came. An email sent directly to her inbox. The words, though cold, were crystal clear. Mario had no intention of allowing her to escape the pain he felt. The email was a chilling manifesto of his hatred. "I never agreed to the divorce. You took everything from me. This is all your fault. By now, I have probably already taken my life and the lives of our children. I hope you can live with that." Daniela's heart dropped into her stomach. She could barely breathe as she read the email over and over. The words blurred together as her mind raced to process the implications. Her first instinct was to call him, demand to know what was going on, to ask if this was some cruel joke. But her calls went unanswered, just like before. With each passing second, the weight of what he had written crushed her under its gravity. Desperation clawed at her. Without thinking, she jumped out of bed and grabbed her keys. It didn't matter that she was still in her pajamas, that the sun had just barely started to rise. Her children were in danger, and she had to get to them. The drive to the house took less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. Daniela's mind replayed the final conversation she had with Helena, her daughter's cheerful voice echoing in her ears. "I can't wait to tell you all about the trails, Mom." Helena had been so excited, so alive. The thought that something could have happened to her, to both of them, was unthinkable. As she approached the familiar mountain road that led to the house, her pulse quickened. The small, peaceful town of Gesat seemed almost too quiet as she turned onto the street. The house loomed ahead, just as she remembered it. The ivy-covered stone, the front yard where the children had played for so many years. But today it felt different. It felt ominous. She parked the car with shaking hands, barely able to steady herself as she made her way to the front door. The house was dark, silent. No sound of children running around, no laughter. There was only the deafening quiet that echoed through the hallways of what had once been her home. With each step, her heart pounded harder. She reached for the door handle, but before she could open it, her mind raced through the worst-case scenarios. What if Mario had already done something? What if she was too late? She couldn't let that thought dominate her mind. She had to see for herself. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Something acrid, metallic, hanging heavy in the air. The smell of death. Her eyes scanned the living room, the dining room. Everything seemed undisturbed, too calm. But as she moved down the hall toward the bedrooms, she felt a coldness creeping along the walls. When she reached the bedroom door, she hesitated. A part of her screamed to turn back, to run away from whatever waited inside, but she had to know. She had to see them. She had to know if they were okay. She pushed the door open. The scene that greeted her was the stuff of nightmares. There, on the bed, lay her children, Helena and Diego, lifeless, motionless. The small bodies of her twins, who had once been the light of her life, now cold and still, their faces twisted in an expression of peace that seemed so out of place in this horror. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't process it. This couldn't be real. Her children, her sweet, vibrant children, were gone. She dropped to her knees, clutching them, shaking them, calling their names in desperation. But they didn't respond. They couldn't respond. "Helena! Diego! Wake up, please!" she screamed, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face as she rocked back and forth, her mind slowly slipping into denial. This had to be a nightmare. Any moment now she would wake up in her own bed, her children still alive, their laughter filling the house once more. But there was no waking up from this. There was no escape from the cruel reality that her children were gone. Neighbors, alerted by her screams, rushed to the house. They found her there, collapsed beside the bed, her arms wrapped around her children as if trying to bring them back to life. The scene was so devastating, so incomprehensible, that they didn't know what to do. All they could do was call the authorities. Within minutes, police arrived at the scene. They found Daniela, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what had happened. She spoke of the messages, the email, the feeling that something was wrong, and how she had driven to the house in a panic. The police immediately began their investigation. It didn't take long for them to piece together what had occurred. Mario had planned everything meticulously, his final act of vengeance against the woman he blamed for the collapse of his world. But what was more chilling than the deaths of the children was the knowledge that Mario had taken a photograph just before the act. A photo that would come to symbolize the twisted finality of his actions. He had posted it on his social media, a picture of him and the children, smiling and carefree during their trip to the mountain house. In that photo, they appeared to be a happy family, oblivious to the darkness that would soon consume them. It was a cruel irony, a final snapshot of a life that no longer existed. At that moment, it became clear to Daniela, and to everyone who knew them, that the peaceful, contented family they had once been was now a tragic memory. And Mario, the calm, collected man everyone had trusted, had become the monster who shattered it all. The discovery of Helena and Diego's bodies sent shockwaves through the community. Daniela was still reeling from the overwhelming despair when the authorities arrived. Her world had collapsed, and the questions about how it could have come to this began immediately. The police set to work, but one question loomed large. Where was Mario? Mario had vanished without a trace. Despite his calm demeanor during the divorce, no one could have imagined he would turn to violence. The search intensified. Initially, there was speculation that he had fled, possibly crossing the border to escape the consequences of his actions. Daniela, still in shock, could hardly comprehend the possibility. She had known Mario as a good father, and it seemed unfathomable that he could be capable of such cruelty. A break came when a neighbor reported seeing Mario's car near the Ponte di Vittoria, a bridge often associated with tragic events. The police rushed to the scene, fearing the worst. It didn't take long for the authorities to find the car parked by the edge of the bridge. It was clear that Mario had gone there with one intention in mind: Hours later, the searchers found Mario's lifeless body at the base of the bridge. He had jumped, confirming the authorities' worst fears. Mario had taken his own life after killing his children. The tragedy had unfolded in stages, and now, with Mario's death, the search for answers seemed hopeless. In the hours before his death, Mario had posted a photo on Instagram. It showed him and his children during their trip to the mountains, smiling and seemingly happy. The image, which would later be referred to as the last selfie, now stood as a cruel reminder of the family that had been destroyed. The photo painted a picture of harmony, but behind it lay a man filled with rage, plotting his family's demise. The autopsies confirmed the children's cause of death: suffocation. Helena and Diego had been murdered while they slept, their lives extinguished in the dead of night. A neighbor had reported hearing noises around 3 a.m. the night before. Around the same time, Mario had sent his chilling messages to Daniela. The realization that the children had been taken in their sleep added a layer of horror to the already unimaginable crime. With Mario dead, the investigation could go no further. Authorities speculated that Mario had meticulously planned his actions, using his calm exterior to mask the deep resentment that had been festering for months. The motive seemed clear: revenge for the divorce, for the life he felt he had lost. But even so, questions lingered. Why had he chosen to take his children's lives? Why hadn't he sought help? For Daniela, the questions were never answered. The pain of losing her children in such a senseless way was made worse by the fact that Mario, the man she had once loved, had turned into a monster. The community was left to mourn the loss of 2 innocent children, and Daniela was left with nothing but haunting memories and unanswered questions. The funerals, held on July 4th, were attended by hundreds. It seemed everyone had been affected by the tragedy in some way, but for Daniela, nothing would ever ease the anguish of losing her children. The town of Gisate was never the same. The story of Helena and Diego's deaths reverberated across Italy, leaving a lasting impact. But for Daniela, the pain was personal. The search for Mario may have ended with his death, but her own search for closure would never be over. The haunting image of her children's last moments would forever be etched in her mind, and the emptiness left by their absence would never be filled. The shock of Helena and Diego's deaths reverberated through Gisate, the small town they had called home. Their funeral on July 4th was attended by hundreds, but for Daniela, no number of mourners could fill the emptiness she felt. The pain of losing her children was overwhelming, and despite the support of the community, nothing could ever ease the void left behind. In the days that followed, people struggled to understand how Mario, once seen as a kind, devoted father, could commit such an unthinkable crime. The calm, loving man that everyone knew now seemed like a stranger. The messages Mario sent to Daniela, blaming her for the breakdown of their marriage, gave some insight into the deep resentment he had been harboring. But they didn't provide any answers as to why he would go so far as to murder his children. His actions, so violent and final, left everyone searching for an explanation that seemed impossible to find. When Daniela arrived at the house, she found her children's bodies, lifeless in their beds, and the sight was more than she could bear. The grief was overwhelming, and the screams that followed alerted the neighbors, who rushed to help. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was already too late. The children were gone. The discovery of Mario's body that afternoon did little to bring closure. The police found his car near the Ponte di Vittoria, a known location for suicides. It was assumed that he had jumped from the bridge after committing the murders, and his body was found soon after. The question that lingered was how a man who seemed incapable of violence could have killed his own children. Mario's final act, posting a photo of himself and the children on social media, became a haunting reminder of what had once been a happy family. The photo, once filled with joy, now symbolized the tragic end of their lives. Investigators concluded that Helena and Diego had likely been suffocated in their sleep on the night of June 26th, just hours before Mario sent the ominous messages to Daniela. A neighbor reported hearing strange noises at around 3 a.m., adding a chilling layer to the timeline of events. It became clear that Mario's actions had been premeditated, yet the reasons behind his actions were still unclear. For Daniela, there would never be closure. The pain of losing her children would never fade. The fact that Mario had taken his own life only added to the mystery. No one would ever fully understand why he did what he did, or why he chose to take the lives of his children as a form of revenge. The last selfie of the family, once a symbol of happiness, now stood as a grim reminder of the tragedy. The image would forever haunt Daniela, as well as the town, which could not comprehend the dark depths of human anger and betrayal. The picture, like the loss of her children, would never be erased from her mind.